So the notion of having community engagement along with these synergy that is provided by advanced and emerging technologies and modes is part of what we want to focus on in this study. Because this allows us the potential to get data both qualitatively and quantitatively at a scale and at levels that previously have not been possible. And so a lot of what is motivating this study is the ability then to look at this data, get this data, and turn it into information that we can act upon in a way that we can generate solutions deliberately that lead to the quality of life aspirations related to sustainable travel. So in the end, when we talk about smart and engaged communities, there's a deliberate notion that we want to look for user-centric solutions that also meet aspirations of communities and more broadly value systems that are increasingly important as well. So in that context, the following have been observed. In most contexts, when you look at these ICSTs, their deployment is rather organic, which means as and when technologies are developed and as and when they show up in communities and at different levels of advancements, their deployment takes place. But there's no a real notion that this is being done in an integrated or systematic manner that can be used to then leverage it beneficially. So, and that's the key challenge, because when there are decision makers in communities, and when I talk about communities, they can be at the level of a city, it can be at the level of a district, at a region, state, or the national level. So in all of these, the ability for decision makers or policy makers to come up with solutions in a way that are systematic, that are systems oriented, but also in a way that they're able to leverage that information deliberately is where quite a few of the challenges are present. So in that sense, even the established technologies in the ICST space have not been leveraged to the potential they could be. And the other aspect is the emerging technologies and modes are already relatively new. So they haven't been systematically explored because they're still in the domain of, or in a flux state, because they're still transitioning to the deployment at a societal level. So what I mean by that is that their deployment, if any, is rather limited at this point. But the potential exists for the technologies and many of the modes, which is where there is the significant potential for innovation as well in terms of meeting the aspirations of systematic, in this case, sustainable travel. The other aspect, and this is also particularly challenging, there's not, the first aspect is well known, which is that there is heterogeneity in the population. So in terms of the social or demographic context, there are different, we are talking about populations with very broad range of characteristics, whether it's in the social or demographic domain or in the context of travel needs and travel aspirations that they have. The other thing is, even though we talk about solutions as being solutions, and typically when we talk about these solutions, they do tend to be top down. You know, that there is the need identified, there is some study done, and then there is a solution and it's deployed with the assumption that this solution has taken into account the needs of or the characteristics of the population, and that's it. And then as challenges develop, then those gaps are again identified, and then there's again studies are done to fill those gaps and so on. Here, what we are saying is that there are multiple stakeholder levels, and we'll talk about that, and they range from the government to the end users of these solutions that are obtained. And the other aspect is that because of these, the social dimension, in the sense that there is heterogeneity, but also there are multiple types of stakeholders involved, the ability for decision makers to come up with solutions that can maximize benefits is also limited. But as importantly, the solutions that are proposed as well, they may be proposed in a way that are meant in the best interests of the public, so public good. So they may have the most optimistic intent possible, or the most benign objectives. But in terms of what happens, there are many real world examples where the solutions may have led to some groups being excluded. So, and this is another value system that has become increasingly important. That is, there's the need for equity in solutions, and equity is not one single dimension. There are multiple dimensions of equity as well that need to be addressed. So in that sense, what we talk about right now is that there are all these emerging technologies and modes. There's no system level perspective to come up with solutions that are deliberately made based on well-informed data. And in that context, solutions may not be stakeholder consistent. And I'll explain what that means, because it's not just about solutions from the perspective of the users alone. It should also make sense from the perspective of the operators. So in that sense, when we talk about sustainable travel, we may not realize them at the highest, the solutions or benefits may not be at the highest possible potential. So in that sense, the question is, how do we come up with solutions that factor all of these aspects that I just discussed? And related to that, there are four primary challenges that exist. The first is even the data itself, and I'll show that a little bit later, has very wide-ranging characteristics, which is what we call disparate data. And how do we come up with solutions that are intelligent, which means they do take into account the characteristics, the objectives, the needs, in a way that make best use of the resources that are available, but also the emerging technologies and emerging modes and so on. And when the solutions are developed, they have to speak to the various stakeholder levels as well, not just in terms of diversity of the user characteristics, but even beyond that, there are operators and there are the needs that arise from the city or community perspective as well. And there needs to be the ability for these communities then to track the progress that is being done by having these solutions can lead to sustainable travel. And sustainability itself is a very broad context. I'll mention what we are looking at in our context here, and how do we then leverage the emergence of new modes as well. So in that context, or in this context, what we have done is originally we had mobility, safety, equity, and accessibility as four objectives that would define sustainability for us. But over time, we also included environmental sustainability, and I'll talk about why that has been the case as well, because in our real world context, we are also able to get data related to air quality and so on. And aspirationally, the need for healthy and active lifestyles is particularly important as a sustainable goal from the perspective of individuals as well, which will improve their, not just physical and mental health, but their well-being more broadly. So aspirationally, how can travel be used to encourage healthy and active lifestyles? So through that, we address those four challenges using a systematic framework. And I'll talk about this framework next. And through methods that are leveraging several different disciplines. And it's not surprising to see that we have transportation systems, engineering, there are a lot of methods there, analytics that come from the policy side, data analytics, behavioral sciences and psychology, then emerging methods such as machine learning, and then we have operations research, simulation, modeling, information science, and so on. The idea or the aspiration for us was we want a framework which is integrated, which means it's holistic in its ability to address multiple objectives, needs, and characteristics of communities. And whatever solution is developed, we want those solutions to be scalable at the community level rather than be meaningful only in small contexts, and that they should be transferable to other communities as well. And it's in this context that we have there's the NSF, the National Science Foundation in the US. There's a project that started in October of 2021, a 4-year, $2.5 million project. And this comes as part of what is called Smart and Connected Communities program. And these are the largest projects they fund at the maximum level of 2.5 million. And aspirationally, the idea was that with all these developments that are taking place in this domain, and I mentioned some of those, the emerging technologies, the existing technologies, the emerging modes, and the shared economy, that can we come up with a blueprint that communities can then use to benefit based on developments that are taking place organically in those communities. And here, I will identify our community partner as the city of Peachtree Corners, which is a suburb of the greater Atlanta region. And then there are other partners. One of these, I'll show that as well, which is Curiosity Lab, which is the innovation ecosystem in the city. And Gwinnett County TransTech. So here, every state has several counties, just like states in India have districts. They have counties here. Gwinnett County is the second largest county in the state of Georgia, which is adjoining the county which includes Atlanta and some other areas. So actually both of these counties are about 1 million people each. So just to illustrate, in the US, these are considered really large communities. So, and then we have a high school because they are part of our influencer systems. And then we also have a partnership for inclusive innovation, which is a statewide program which seeks to develop communities, especially those communities which have challenges in meeting the various functionalities that most communities would take for granted. So we want to come up with solutions which are multidimensional, and I'll show what we mean by multidimensional, because they're multidimensional in terms of the objectives that need to be addressed. They're multidimensional in terms of the stakeholders they have to reach. They're multidimensional in terms of the mechanisms that are used. So, and these have to meet the needs at the community level. Then various stakeholders themselves, users, the operators, the city, and so on, and across the stakeholder levels as well. I'll briefly illustrate the community from here on. We'll call Peachtree Corners as PTC. And if you see here, this is the city of Atlanta. If you see, and this is inside the perimeter, that's typically what, and outside of the perimeter. That's how typically it's called. And the actual city of Atlanta is only about 450,000 people. But if you look at the greater Atlanta region, that's about 6 million people. So that illustrates the scale of this region. And this is the northeastern suburb of Peachtree Corners. And this has a population of 42,000 people. It's the largest city in Gwinnett County. That county goes somewhere out here. So you'll see that. You'll see Duluth, which is where I live. And then there are multiple such suburbs that you'll see all around Atlanta. But this is a planned community. It was a deliberate one, which encourages the use of technology. And the part of their intent is how they can leverage technology to improve the quality of life for their residents. So I mentioned communities. There are 4 types of communities that are of interest here. The users, which include the residents, the employees, visitors, and so on. The influencers, which are these big entities that have a disproportionate, typically a disproportionate, potential disproportionate influence, because schools have students and they have families, employers, especially the larger ones, have multiple employees. Then we have NGOs, which have several objectives that they seek to address. And we also included this notion of religious places, primarily because there are these places where people gather as communities at different, probably every week as well. So the ability to reach these audiences, or when I say audiences, community members in different contexts is particularly important. The other one relates to providers. Providers of mobility in, for example, the Indian context, you would say you will have those who operate the bus system, those who operate the rail system, those who operate the roads. So when you say mobility, mobility is, it can be in the private sector or public sector. One of our partners is Gwinnett County Transit, which provides transit in this county, the Gwinnett County. So that's a public sector entity. But there are multiple private sector entities as well in Gwinnett County. And, we talked about Uber, Lyft, but there are multiple other micro mobility providers as well. The other one, when we talk about providers, is information providers, because part of what we are looking at here is how we can leverage information so that we can come up with solutions that are provided so that people are aware of the possibilities or opportunities that are there in terms of transportation or travel options for them. So when we talk about providers, they're both in this, in both the mobility, but also in the information domain. And in our context, the governance is the city, which includes the city mayor, the city manager, the city assistant manager, and then the whole set of ecosystem that is managing the city. And we currently engage this community through several types of events, because communities have events and festivals that we reach out to. We also have conducted what are called town hall meetings, where we invite community members to come and provide feedback through surveys that we have. There's also an app that the community itself has, through which information and surveys, in this case, we have a community app that we are developing, or we have almost finished developing, that can be used to provide information, but also solicit feedback from people, residents and others, in terms of how well the solutions are working. And I mentioned information, and in information, there are multiple ways to reach audiences or the residents. One is where we have for example, bus stops. There are smart kiosks. But there are also other ones which are large displays that are mobile, that can be placed anywhere in the city. So there are these large displays that we can move around if we feel that that allows us to reach audiences. So in that sense, you will see that the types of technologies that are there, we have autonomous vehicles, we have an AV lane. So here what you see is actually this is Ollie autonomous shuttle that actually is going on a lane that currently exists. This is about 1.5 mile one, which covers the ecosystem for Curiosity Lab, which is where a lot of high-tech companies exist in the city of Peachtree Corners. So right now, if you look at a real-world immersive lab, there are very few of these. Of course, here you'll see that there are temporary barriers to separate regular vehicles from an actual AV lane in which just an autonomous shuttle can operate. But this is how it is. Anybody can go on those roads except in the autonomous shuttle lane. But these have to also cross intersections, so there are interactions that are there. And in addition to that, you have, for example, electric vehicle charging stations. I talked about displays. Then we have DSRC roadside units. These are all related to connected capabilities, vehicle to everything, connectivity, vehicle to vehicle, vehicle to infrastructure, and so on. So there are actual connected technologies that are put into place. And on top of that, there are also these intelligent cameras and signals, smart street lights that provide Wi-Fi, but also have the ability to collect data, and also some other smart energy technologies. So with that, if you look at the various modes in Gwinnett County, you'll see that mostly in this area, in PTC, the city, there are only two public routes, and I'll show them next and so on. I talked about a 3-mile test track, there's 1.5 mile in each direction, and then you have micro mobility, which is scooter. Right now they have a new contract with a e-bicycle company. So these are all micro mobility options. And these options also have roles to play as well. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. So the other thing you'll note is this is a planned community, but as the communities go, this is also one of the more, what you would say, affluent communities as well. So if you look at the mode of transportation, about 85% of the transportation in these communities is through private vehicles. And so that contributes, of course, to congestion in certain areas. Not all. I mean, this is a suburb, so there are certain areas which represent common arterials and so on, where there are significant levels of congestion. And there's a need for coordination so that when we look at these other modes that are there and modes that are emerging, we can deploy them in a way that we can get to more sustainable travel options. So how are we engaging with the PTC? Remember, I mentioned that through enabling sustainable travel through engaged communities. So, for example, this represents one of the real situations where we got community members to come, provide their feedback on the various types of transportation options, but what are the challenges they face, all of that. That's one. So these are the workshops and meetings, and some of them have already taken place. And then we also have this app that we have been developing, which is a smartphone app through which we conduct surveys, but also we collect real-time data, and we can also provide solutions which are personalized, which means at the individual level. And then the providers, there are multiple providers that are there. And even in the context of AV shuttles and so on, there are multiple providers, those that provide the vehicles, but then there's a whole ecosystem where data needs to be collected, data needs to be stored, data needs to be disseminated. So it's not just the company that runs the shuttle, but there are a whole other set of partners that are required for these to operate. And then we have Gwinnett County Transit, from which we get data in real time on their transit routes and so on, where the vehicles are, usage and so on, transit ridership. And in addition to that, we have the city, which is what we call the governance. So we can collect data, which is owned by the city, but as you'll see, a lot of the data is not owned by the city, so that we can develop policy decisions as well, but also we can provide information at different parts of the community through the interactive screens that I mentioned, which are mobile. We can deploy this really large interactive displays that can be placed anywhere, and also through various Wi-Fi access points. And then I also talked about influencers, the large employers and others. And in addition to that, the ecosystem, which is Curiosity Lab, where there's emerging infrastructure. So part of what PTC does, it invites companies, it invites anyone to come and use those facilities for free. So their aspiration is that when these companies and others come and use those facilities, the city will gain. So there is a symbiotic relationship that they feel is particularly important. So that's why it's a living lab, and it allows us to track progress towards the sustainable travel. So what is the framework that we have, which is primarily what this we are working on, and which we'll be using at different levels to come up with solutions. And I'll try to go into as much detail as possible, time permitting. And I'll start first with a very high level of how we came up with this framework. So first, you always have the various levels of stakeholders, and based on the activities that take place, we can collect data through ICSTs, and what that means is information communication and sensor technologies, but also through community engagement. And this data, is then used in a deliberate way so that we can integrate it to come up with an idea of the current state of the community. And I call it a multidimensional state. You'll understand why we call it that in just a little bit. So the objective of collecting data from the various sources and various types of data and integrating it is to see where we are in terms of the transportation context in that community. And because we have multiple objectives that we seek to address, that helps us to understand this data in terms of the various objectives that we have. So once we collect that data and have it in a form that allows us to leverage it in multiple dimensions, the next is to come up, assess what is the current state in terms of sustainability. And I'll talk about what we mean by sustainable. It's primarily in terms of the objectives that I mentioned earlier. And then we break down the community into smaller spatial entities and then come up with an optimization to identify in these smaller, actually in our case, it is block level. It may be, you can call it zone, whatever it is, whatever level satisfies your need, to identify at the spatially disaggregate level how each of those blocks or each of those zones, if you want to call it, whatever spatial unit you have, is in terms of your sustainability objectives related to, say, mobility, safety, access, and accessibility, and then equity, and so on. So when we do that, we start with what is there, then we optimize it to see where we want to be. So we try to come up with the aspiration, that is, what is the desirable solution? And that then represents our desired solution at the community level. And the reality is, we may have certain aspirations in terms of what we want for the community, but we have to also work in the real world. So in the real world, we have, as we talked, heterogeneity in multiple dimensions in terms of the community residents and others who use the transportation system. So there are differences in their behaviors and attitudes. We also have different types of providers. Just because we want a solution doesn't mean that the solution will be available, because somebody has to provide the resources as well. And this is important because it's not always that we look for public sector solutions. And this is true even in the Indian context, where I remember, there was a mention earlier that I had been to that, in 2018, I had been to the MOVE conference that was organized by the government of India. And I had been there as a guest and so on. And I remember the aspiration for the government was, we will provide the higher level infrastructure or a higher level context where you, as the private sector, will hopefully come and look for innovative solutions. And that's an aspiration that's going to be true more broadly as well. That would be true more and more around the world as well. So in the US too, that's an aspiration. How does the private sector come in? And they will come in only if they see opportunity, but they'll also come in when they see innovation in terms of solutions that do not exist right now as well. And more broadly, we can look at public-private partnerships as well. And these are some of the things we are looking at in our context here. So what we do is, based on the solutions that we have, we try to first come up with a representation of the population, and then we see how the population would respond to, and not just the population, the solutions that are needed from the provider side, how they would actually fit in the real world, because in the real world, people behave the way they want to based on multiple objectives and constraints. So this then gives us some representation of what the community will look like if we bring in the real world, which is people and others that make up that community and where there's a substantial heterogeneity. So once we do that, we want to now come up with solutions that are consistent with how people behave, that are consistent with what operators or providers are willing to do, and what a community is willing to do as well. For example, even in the context, we had our meeting with the city last week, because we do it once every 6 months in addition to the regular meetings that we have with the community and so on. So one of the things they don't do is they don't have penalties for people who are parked in certain locations for long periods of time, even when they don't need to be parked. So they don't have any penalty, and that's part of that community. So there are things they're willing to do, there are things they're not willing to do. And so all of these are things that we have to take into account when trying to see what is the solution, which is from an aspirational standpoint, to a solution that set of solutions that are really possible and which can work. So by factoring the real world in terms of attitudes and behavior and so on, there are three types of solutions. The three types of solutions we look at. Some of these are emerging mobility, and that's why we show the partnership here between the transit and the other emerging micromobility. And we have behavioral interventions, and I'll talk about those, which are primarily incentive mechanisms, and also public policy interventions that are taken at the city level as well. And once we do that, there's a need to deliver that in a way that reaches the various stakeholders. And these are not just the users, as I mentioned earlier. So there are multiple ways in which we reach the community in terms of the app, in terms of the smart kiosks. The community has a website as well through workshops and meetings. And for the city, plans and guidelines we provide, as well as plans that we also propose to the providers, because there are partnerships between private and public sectors. So these are all the various information delivery mechanisms. And then the cycle continues, because we reach the various stakeholders, then people act, providers act, then we actually have data, and this is a continuing cycle with the hope that over time, using the metrics we have, we can reach the community aspirations related to sustainable travel. So this is the primary framework of today's presentation. And I'll try to go a little faster through each of these individual systems. So you'll see we have the integrated information system, the sustainability assessment pathways, the virtual community simulation, the multidimensional solution options, and then the stakeholder consistent information design. So these are all the various aspects of this. So when we look at the integrated information system, it's actually a pretty big challenge, because we have data at multiple timescales, actually from multiple sources and multiple locations. So both spatially and temporally, data is very disparate. And also this data is not from any one source. And we have to integrate all of that to understand the community's current state, so that we can come up with some way to measure progress from the perspective of the community. So in this context, we actually develop a visualization platform. And the reason we developed that is because you can say that, oh, you can use GIS, but actually it's not sufficient to address the types of challenges that are needed in this context. So we actually developed one of these. And you'll see that there are several types of data. There's socio-demographic, accident, autonomous vehicle data, traffic count, transit, weather, travel, road network data. And you'll see that there are different time scales here. Some of it is discrete, some of it is daily, hourly, real time. And you'll see that this data is at different spatial levels as well. Some of that is at the census tract level, other is in a road link, another is at bus stops or shuttle stops. And there are some data that we get at the city level. So you'll see that temporally and spatially and the source, they can be very different ones, and all of these need to be combined. And when we combine all of these, this represents the city, the Peachtree Corners. And I'll illustrate that in a little more detail next. So this is what we get as a picture in the city that I'll talk about here. So in our case study, for example, one case study just by collecting the data and seeing where things are. So here what you see at the bottom is the dedicated lane for the autonomous vehicle shuttle. And there's not a test facility. This probably is one of the few in the world, actually, where you'll see that these vehicles interact with regular traffic, which means human-driven vehicles, without any particular warning, anything. Vehicles go, these shuttles go, and they interact at these intersections, even though there are barriers to separate them on regular lanes. And so that's what you see here as well, and here. So it has a 3-mile test, AV test track. So that is shown here in terms of the track is along the blue stars here. And that also is the one where we have the AV shuttle as well. So those are the stars that illustrate the route for the AV shuttle. And then PDC, the city wants to determine how to extend this AV route, because it's just right now in that district, the innovation district of Curiosity Lab, but they want to extend it. And part of the question is, how do you, where do you extend it to? And so they have a preliminary plan that they developed, but then there are a lot of other things that come into play here as well. So if you look at the routes that are operated by the transit provider, which is Gwinnett County Transit, which is a public transit entity, there's one that actually goes through the city, which is through the red star shown here. So there's an elaborate route you'll see here that goes through the city and so on. So this is the primary route. There's another route, which is route 10AB, which goes along the edge of the city. So it goes, but in a, on a road, which is at the edge of the city. So these are the two routes. And the other thing you'll see here in terms of the color coding of the different parts is these are some of the lower income areas. These are some of the higher income areas. These are somewhere in between. And that's how the different areas of the city are organized. And so there are challenges and needs that will show up. And right here is the downtown for the city, which is where a lot of activities there, because there's a big mall, there are other activities that take place. So aspirationally, a lot of people want to get to these areas, especially say on weekends and maybe even during the evening times in the week as well. And so the question is, how do we do that? So we leverage a lot of the data that's available in terms of the blue oval here. That's where 45% of the population is. Most apartment complexes are there. Then here is where there are grocery stores. And this actually represents sufficient distance that it in some ways becomes, if you want to call it, a grocery store desert, because for people living out here, there's no real route to get to the grocery stores. So that is part of the challenge that's there, especially if they don't have their own individual vehicle. So there is a gap there in terms of need and in terms of actual transit availability. So the red oval, on the other hand, is 35% higher income, largely disconnected from existing transit because they have their own vehicles. So that's why you have more private vehicles and higher congestion. So right now, this area is transit desert. So just by looking at what is available there, one of the things that could be done is, in addition to extending the shuttle route to the downtown area, which sees a lot of need, we can also extend it in this area because there is a very clear need. And that's what we illustrate here, that this is how we can extend. The yellow flashing one can illustrate how we do it out here. So you may ask, okay, it makes sense to extend it in this way, the shuttle, so that people can reach these large grocery areas, stores and so on, and connect it to the apartment complexes, which are shown in as the green dots here. So the question is, why do you need it here? And this is where part of the thing is related to sustainability. If you want to have sustainable solutions, you have to provide options to people so that they'll see value in switching from their vehicle to using options that are available that are more sustainable. So a simple example, which is very intuitive in this context, may not seem intuitive here, but makes sense in the sense of trying to achieve the sustainability objectives for the city, because by providing these solution options that can enhance the ability or provide alternatives for people to use. And so we want to look at the sustainability assessment pathways and solutions. The metrics I already talked about before. So even in the metrics, there are different types of specific metrics that we consider. As I told you, I don't want to go too detail into these because I want to leave a few minutes also for Q&A as well. So we use this the sustainability assessment and pathways to come up with the various types of potential solutions that are possible, that multidimensional, so that we come up to the level where we have the aspirational solutions at the community level. So after that, we have to bring in the real world, and these are some of the details related to how we do the optimization at the spatial level to get this multidimensional solution. And you'll see that in the real world, there are rather poor characteristics. They're nonlinear, non-convex, mixed integer, large scale, multi-objective. The real world becomes particularly challenging. So there are methods we have used in this context. But as I said, they don't factor stakeholders' heterogeneity, which is where we come up with the virtual community simulation. And when we look for the spatial solution, if you recollect, I said that we do it at a scale that makes sense in our context. In this case, we use what are called blocks rather than sensor tracks. Blocks are much smaller in size. And then we come to the multi-agent virtual community simulation. So here we translate these solutions at the community level, which are desirable solutions, into those which factor in the reality in terms of behavior of users, but also in terms of what resources the providers can provide as well. And so we scale behavioral interventions that I'll talk about and emerging mobility solutions. And in that context, we need this in terms of simulating rather complex variables that show up in the real world, in terms of behaviors, in terms of information delivery, the various travel modes that are there, to handle the various multidimensional aspects that I mentioned. So we have sorry, I just put some information for myself. Okay. All right. So to meet the influencers' impacts as well as the provider's goals and constraints as well. And then we have different types of simulations. So why do we do that? I already mentioned that if we want to have solutions that are consistent with people's or individuals and providers' behavior, that has a higher chance of leading these solutions to more sustainable metrics. Otherwise, we'll have challenges. And these pathways consider the individual stakeholders, but also integrates their heterogeneity and the multimodal travel context, which means that when we look for solutions, it's not one or the other. It may involve multiple modes at the same time. For example, some of the solutions that people are aware of, I'm sure here as well, is we look for solutions that integrate across the public and private sector, the first and last mile travel, where we try to get people to transit routes by using micro-mobility, for example. So that's one of the solutions that we're looking at in this context as well. And so these are solutions that represent the various dimensions of solutions. I'll skip this slide because I want to spend a little time on the multidimensional solution options. And there are three. One is behavioral interventions, which are novel types of incentive mechanisms that are provided for people to make a solution or try to nudge them towards more sustainable travel options. Sorry. Okay, so I thought there was some noise there. Okay, the next thing is collaboration within the ACT Lab to come up with emerging mobility solutions, which I just mentioned, related to partnerships involving the private and public sector. In terms of public policy interventions, right now we are looking at encouraging electric vehicle usage and how that can be fostered as well. So in terms of the behavioral intervention strategies, there are multiple ones. So what are called tangible incentives typically are monetary, because when you provide money, that's very clear, and a lot of people respond to that. But they may not be sustainable because somebody has to find the money to provide. So the question is, are there other types of solutions? And if you look in the incentive domain, we looked at nudges, which are just voluntary pushes that people can be nudged towards, and informational messages, gamification. And so these are all leveraging some of the emerging, or some of the delivery mechanisms that are already in place, and so the comfort with social media, especially the current generations and so on. And also those that speak to the aspirations of individuals in terms of their well-being related to health and so on. And so we are doing, right now, we are in the process of doing online surveys to test the various strategies. And then we'll actually, after getting these online surveys, we will actually implement some of these in the field, which are more effective. And we're not looking at any one type of intervention. We're looking at bundles of them. We may have money with nudges or information with health and environmental messages and so on. So we are planning to do that. So we're in the process of actually conducting these surveys first, so that in the end, when we deploy these to the residents, and we actually have timelines where we'll do that, we can come up with an understanding of how people respond to these behavioral strategies, so that they would go to more sustainable alternatives. That is, other opportunities to at least partly shift people from the usage of their personal vehicles to more sustainable options like transit, like walking, like bicycles, like combinations of transit and others. So those are the things that we are trying to address here. And this is just an app that we are developing in this context. Actually, Rupa is one of our, she is the one developing this app along with a whole bunch of other students. So, and then the emerging mobility solutions, I talked about partnerships involving the public transit agency with emerging private modes in emerging modes, like Uber, Lyft, e-scooters, and so on, to address the first mile, last mile needs to get to the transit, whether it is in the morning or in the evening or whenever people trying to get to transit or get to their homes, it doesn't matter. So, and in that context, this also can address equity issues, because accessibility equity is one of the challenges, especially for people who are less fortunate in terms of income and so on. So the ability to have their vehicles is not as high as others. So public policy interventions, again, these behaviors relate to use of electric vehicle infrastructure. Where can we locate electric vehicle charging stations? What are some of the incentives we can provide for people to charge, parking, all of that? Because we can provide parking only for EVs in certain areas which are rather heavily used. So there are all types of incentives that are possible. Of course, these also would require enforcement. And here as well, there are ways by which they can be enforced, because you can change the rate of charge, how much you charge based on the number of hours a vehicle is located. So as vehicles are located at the charging stations for a longer period of time, you substantially increase the penalty for that. And so that people know this ahead of time. And so these are some of the interventions that are possible. And then there are ways by which we can deliver this. I mentioned this earlier as well out here. And some of these are nudges, some of these are through the app, some of these are through this large information displays that I mentioned that are mobile. So we can, the city has several of those, we can place them. And sometimes it's simply this notion that people are not aware of the options they have. And being aware of these options can allow them to make more informed decisions. So in summary, if you look at the capabilities, we need to address multiple challenges systematically and holistically. We have leveraging of organic emergence of new technologies and modes through sustainable modes and fostering partnerships, and then systematically looking at multidimensional solution options that integrate both demand and supply. The demand in terms of the behavioral intervention, supply in terms of emerging modes and partnerships, and then other policy interventions on the supply side. So that in the end, we are trying to come up with solutions that people are willing to take through these incentives and other mechanisms, but also from an aspirational standpoint, beyond the sustainability option aspect, even have solutions that enhance the equity across the population and also access to solution options. And so there are new types of solutions that are consistent with what stakeholders are willing to provide, and we also leverage new methods and models. So the last slide is a broad overview. Is when we look at these problems that are emerging in communities where there are these technology, especially the multiple types of technologies that are showing more and more in societies. So this is true everywhere around the world. There are all that provide opportunities, but these technologies, they show up in very different contexts, very different ways. There's no systematic way they show up. So it can be particularly challenging and overwhelming to solution providers or the city managers or whoever it is that are looking for solutions. They may say, well, all of this is happening, how do I really benefit from it? And the other thing that's happening, which will continue to happen around the world again, is these emerging mobility modes. And so the various types of data and the fact that in a real community, we have multiple stakeholder levels and multiple types of stakeholders, even within a single level. And the question is, how can we leverage all of this to meet sustainable travel aspirations of a community? And in that context, we develop this systematic and holistic framework. As you can see, these are all at different levels. So all of these are going in parallel. The various components of the framework that I discussed, there are multiple students working on this. There are actually 5 or 6 PhD students, a postdoc, and others that are working on this. So the idea is to come up with a solution framework that is scalable, transferable, and very importantly, that communities can operate by themselves over time while addressing equity and access and leveraging the. And finally, I wanted to recognize the team members, my colleague Omar Asencio from the School of Public Policy, Kibriya, who is actually one of most of these are my students. He is actually managing this at a high level. And then we have Rupa, Yufei, Yuming, who are all students in my PhD students, and postdoc Ching, as well as Ifan, who is working with my colleague Omar. And then a lot of undergraduate interns and students that are working on solutions as well. And with that, I just wanted to thank you one and all for the opportunity to present. I'll be happy to take any questions or listen to any comments you have.
Thank you, Professor Peeta. That was really an enlightening talk. Now the forum is open for discussion. So there's a question in the chat box. The question is, how the conflicting aspirations are taken care of in this project? Are there different weightages provided for elements?
That's an excellent question. And that is part of what our methodology, and I mentioned there, we do multi-objective optimization. In the interest of time, I actually have slides even related to that, but I didn't want to go through that. But this is an important question. How do you, weigh the various objectives? In the end, it also depends on the particular community. And I'll give an example why that is important. But what I'll say is the models and methods that we develop allow for these weights to be placed. So in multi-objective optimization, you can place one weight on mobility, another on safety, third on access, and fourth, equity. So we can change those. The reason why this should be flexible and it's something that the community or the city should be able to actually determine for itself. What I mean by that is where are the challenges is if you look at the community, the PTC, which is a community we have been working for a period of time, which is why it was natural for us to go with this community to work with. This is, if you want to call it, a more, I would say, affluent community because it's organized, it's deliberate. There are lower income individuals here as well, but we are not talking just about lower income individuals. We are also talking about individuals who don't have access to smartphones or older people who may not be that comfortable with technology. So when we talk about equity and access, that's why I said it's not related to just mobility options, but it also relates to information options. It's not just about lower income. It can be about people who are more challenged in terms of operating with technology or interacting with technology. Especially seniors have that challenge because they're not as exposed to technology compared to some of the recent generations. Or it can be people who don't have access to smartphones and so on. So the important point about this, why I mentioned this, is because even in Georgia, the state where Georgia Tech is, there are communities that are very different in their characteristics, where 80% of the population there is in very disadvantaged areas, which means they're poor, they don't have access to facilities and so on. But there is the potential for public transit to operate in a way that can enhance their ability to access travel and so on. Because having access to travel is particularly important, and for I'm sure this is true even in India. Here in the US, there's been very clear real world experience during the pandemic when all the transit systems were shut down because people were worried about the spread of the disease. At that time, the people who suffered the most were people who didn't have their own individual vehicles. And ironically, these were the individuals that needed to get to specific locations to work. Most of them didn't have the option of working remotely. They needed to get to specific locations based on their job type that they do, and they had no way of getting there. So it's important to understand that different communities have different characteristics, which is why, in the end, the ability for the framework should be that it should allow the communities to determine how much they weigh each of these. That will allow them to then determine how to put the limited resources they have into play so that they can come up with the solutions that meet the aspirations of their community's characteristics.
So another question in the chat box that is they're asking in scientist only, like could you also shed light on how the various data forms are merged into actionable information and how these duplicates were avoided?
Okay, so we actually have let me see if I have that out here. Let me see if I have a slide related to that. I actually had a slide that I just didn't. Let's see if I had that slide here. Is it this slide? I'm not sure. Yeah, so let me unhide this slide and then I'll show you that. So let me go here. All right, so here we have a dynamic data visualization platform that is being developed, and I have to be very honest, I'm completely illiterate on the details of this, but my students are experts on this, so they know. So they use, these are it's the Python-based packages that they use. So they're called HoloViews, Bokeh, GeoPandas, Matplot, the library, and so on. So the reason for using a Python-based platform here is we can visualize the data in distinct layers and combine, because what these libraries allow us to do is they allow us to be highly customizable. So we can actually look at any layer or any combination of layers that allows us to use and see the interactions among the various layers, so that when we're looking for solutions in the example that we provided, we can actually look and immediately visualize, oh, this would be a great option for us to have. So we wanted something that was dynamic, something that we could visualize so that different layers or subset of layers that we needed to understand certain characteristics can be brought into play. And that's why we used a Python-based platform. And so this is what you see here. This is one. And you'll see that there are multiple layers of data that are combined here, from the weather, traffic, accident, transit, the demographic data, the AV shuttle, locations where it's currently located, all of that, and even the transit bus, where is it located. So you can do it at the real-time level, you can do it at a higher planning level scale of time. So this is how all of this data is integrated to come up with the characteristics. So when you say actionable, that is where we make use of this data and come up with the models that we are developing. And I'll show you here. I don't know whether there's a slide here related to that. So it was mentioned, yeah. So when we do this multi-objective optimization, we actually take all of this data together. And I'll just go to the basic framework because the framework will explain for us this thing as well. There you go. So this framework, because the questions seem to be rather broad, so I'm trying to place that question here. When you say actionable information, so you go from here, you have the data, you go to this point where we leverage this multi-objective optimization to come up with the benchmark for in terms of mobility for that block, in terms of accessibility where it is, in terms of safety where it is, in terms of equity. And this may vary across the various blocks. On the other hand, the city will look at it holistically, but then we have to look at solutions that also are addressing the characteristics of these various areas of this community, and these characteristics can be different, which is why when we come up with these solutions, we come up with them saying that this is where we are, this is where we want to be, and these gaps can be different for different blocks in that community. And so when we say actionable information, we are now at a point where we have a desired solution for different parts of that community. And then we see that, okay, this is our aspirational solution, but we really, just saying that I'll deploy that solution will not work because people behave the way they want to. And that's completely normal because they have their own individual objectives, they have their own needs, constraints, resources, all of that. And the same thing with a public sector, a provider as well. Just because I tell Gwinnett County Transit, hey, this route is particularly valuable, add it, they're not going to do it. They have to see value in it for themselves. Because most of these routes, and these are changeable too. It's not that they're wedded to a particular route. They can change it, but they need to be convinced as to why. And in terms of the private sector, they're going to be there only if they see profit opportunities for themselves. So there are multiple objectives, multiple aspirations there that all need to be reconciled. And that's where, when we say actionable information into solutions, this is where the solutions are. So some of these are at the level of the providers, some of these are at the level of the individual users, some of these are at the community level. And then we deploy these solutions. I hope that answers the question that was asked, or if there was anything more specific than that.
Yeah, anybody would like to interact any further? Sir, I need one clarification, just like
Sure.
you said the mod share is something like 80% for private and all those things. And
Right.
you're planning for some kind of sustainable and smart mobility, definitely. And how the purpose, what purpose is brought into this particular scheduling or planning part?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand the question. Can you repeat that?
Sir, the purpose of the trip, how it is brought in into this sustainability planning.
Very good, and that's important because part of what we have been doing is also the. Let me see where it is. I may actually have a slide for that as well. So. I actually may not have put that slide in here, but essentially what happens is when we talk about demand, so part of what we are doing right now, in fact, we are in the process of the virtual simulation. Sorry, let me just try to see if I even have a slide. I may actually have a slide later on related to this that will illustrate exactly the question that you asked. Is it this? No, not this. Let's see. There was a slide which actually illustrated the details of how we are collecting the data and so on related to that. Maybe it's not here, but I can explain it to you. So essentially what we are looking at in this virtual community simulation slide, that component is exactly that. So when we say scales behavioral interventions and emerging mobility solutions, part of what we do here is to characterize that behavior and so on and collect data related to this. So one of that thing that we're doing there is developing these demand models themselves. Because as you said, the trip purpose makes a difference. If somebody is going to work, they're not going to be particularly amenable to saying, okay, I'll provide this incentive to use this other service, which is more sustainable. So they may not. But there may be a subset of travelers who see that incentive as particularly beneficial to them. Then they say, okay, I'm going to shift, I'm going to gain some. And this is because they may, they may not be as affluent as some of the other people. So they may actually shift to this. On the other hand, when we talk about, say, a leisure trip or trip to go to the downtown, weekend, that's why we were suggesting, for example, even in those areas that are more affluent, to have some such service reach out there, because you cannot tell people, okay, use this service, try to get to more sustainable travel without providing them options that they can use. And in fact, in many cases, even what we have found in our surveys as well is many of the people in these affluent areas, what they say is that there's no option in our area. There's no transportation option. So we are just forced to use our individual vehicles. And if those options were available, we would definitely consider that. So what that is saying is that the value system, that they are sensitive to this notion of environmental sustainability. So they see the importance of doing this, and they would actually enjoy it, for example, to go from that part to the downtown area. And because it's for a leisure trip, they won't have as many constraints in terms of reaching certain locations at certain times. And the other thing is, even during the regular, workday trip, there are some areas that are heavily congested because they tend to be arterials that go across from the suburbs to the city area, the Atlanta city area. So these tend to be heavily traveled. So if you have a transit option, which is a dedicated lane, that can be persuasive even for other people as well. So there are multiple types of factors that can persuade people to make their decisions, and it's not necessarily based on incentives alone. So in that sense, when we're developing the models for the virtual system simulation, we are taking into account the trip purpose as one of the characteristics, because that can have differential effect on the behavior as well, as you just mentioned. So
thank you, sir. Thank you. Sir, there is one query from Dr. Vasudevan. The transferability of the model. Is the developed framework can it be transferred to another place where the demography is different?
Yes. In fact, that was I'll go back to this slide, and that was deliberate. In fact, that is something that we said aspirationally, even when we developed this framework, or even when I was proposing this framework in the proposal itself, that was one of the things that I very clearly mentioned at that point. That is, in the end, if we say that these are challenging to communities or cities, we cannot provide them with a framework which makes them dependent on us. Because if that's the case, at some point, as you know, people leave. The people in the city also will leave, but people who are providing the solutions, they may also leave. So you want to get to a framework that is able to address the various characteristics that need to be looked into, and the data that needs to be generated, all of that, so that these can be deployed. It was very deliberate on our part to have this particular framework because, as I mentioned earlier, there are communities in Georgia which are very disadvantaged. There are communities which are very affluent. There are mixed communities which are partly affluent or not. And it's not just about income alone. There are communities, if you look at the city, Atlanta area, the midtown, downtown, they're highly densely active areas. So you'll see a lot of travel there. So the solutions that make sense there may not make as much sense in the suburbs, for example. So we wanted to come up with a framework where organically the various cities can introduce the various types of emerging mobility solutions. So even those, they vary by the community or city that is operating them. So it depends on, so it's rather, if you want to call it, at a disaggregated level, because these are not a single community. There are various areas or various cities that have jurisdictions for themselves. So as I said, the city of Atlanta itself is only 450,000 people. So there are many other communities around which have very different characteristics. So we wanted to come up with a solution that could be deployed in any of these in a way that leverages the data that's possible the emerging mobility solutions, and in a way that we take into account the community characteristics in terms of the individuals that make up that community, as well as the aspirations that the city or the community leadership had for their community as well. So in some sense, in the end, we should be able to allow decision makers and policy makers to come up with solutions. And this again ties to the earlier question that was raised related to the weights for the various objectives. So this is again the flexibility that allows us to do that.
Yeah, anybody else would like to interact, Professor Peeta? Either in the chat box or to any more interactions or discussions or doubts or clarifications? Yeah, I think there are no more questions, sir. Anyway, it's a very nice presentation. Ardra, please.
Now I invite Dr. Vasudevan N, Junior Scientist at NATPAC, to deliver the vote of thanks.
Good evening, everyone. On behalf of NATPAC, I would like to extend my heartfelt gratitude to each one of you for joining us today for this insightful technical talk on the topic enabling sustainable travel in smart and engaged communities. It has been an enlightening and thought-provoking session, shedding light on the advancements in sustainable mobility. First and foremost, I would like to express my sincere thanks to our esteemed speaker, Professor Srinivas Peeta, whose expertise and knowledge have truly motivated our audience. So thank you, Professor, for delivering an engaging and informative presentation. We are grateful for the knowledge and insights you have shared with us today. I would like to express my gratitude to all the attendees for your presence and active involvement. The questions and discussions that followed the talk elicited your deep interest in the subject matter and is appreciable. Further, I would like to extend my gratitude to our director, section heads, and the organizing team for their meticulous planning and coordination that made this smooth execution of this program. In conclusion, I believe we all have gained valuable insights from today's technical talk, and let us carry this knowledge forward to achieve the goals of sustainability in the transportation sector. Thank you once again to everyone involved, and we look forward to hosting more technical talk in this series and continuing this legacy. Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. Bye-bye.
Thank you, sir. Looking forward to.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Peeta.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity here. I hope it was beneficial or helpful. so.
Okay. Again, we will disturb you in the near future. We will invite you. Okay. So when you will be visiting India?
I actually, I'll actually be there sometime next week. But this time I'm going on a personal trip because I have to take care of some needs for my parents. So normally I come, I'm very active on this, but this time I have to help them on some of their things. So I'll be actually going there. And so this time it will be difficult because there are actual things that I have to take care to help them. So
okay. Probably the next time, probably we will make it.
Yes, definitely. Thank you. Thanks for that invitation. So
yeah, you are welcome, Peeta.
Okay, take care.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you.
Sure.
Good
Bye-bye.
night.